on the plan revision to new Reg 0654 FEMA Rep 1. My name is Bill Mayer. I'll be the facilitator for this afternoon's meeting. And I'd like to emphasize on this slide the word discussion. It's meant to be a dialogue with the affected organizations and the public on items to consider for the proposed revision of the new Reg 0654 FEMA Rep 1 guidance document manual. Okay, I'd like to turn to the folks in the room, and I'd like to ask Mr. Michael Mariotte to come and make a comment. And please, for the folks in the room and for the folks remotely, please state your name and your affiliation before you give your comment.
Thank you. I'm Michael Mariotte. I'm Executive Director of Nuclear Information and Resource Service. Thank you for holding this meeting. We appreciate the NRC's interest in emergency planning and the need to improve the existing inadequate emergency evacuation and planning regulations and guidance documents. We have proposed serious and meaningful improvements to the existing emergency planning regulations through a petition for rulemaking that I'm sure you know about. This petition, which is supported by thousands of people across the U.S., we believe should be acted on in an expedited fashion by the NRC and should inform any changes to the guidance documents that we are talking about here. And I also want to say that, the emergency planning rules are inadequate right now. The guidance documents are inadequate right now. The American people are not adequately protected right now. And I, for one, would really like to see you have a much greater sense of urgency at fixing these problems that I'm seeing here today. I don't think it needs to take 5 years to do this work. I appreciate the openness and the commitment to public comments that's been expressed today, but I don't think that needs to be the reason we take so long to do this. Our recommendations are clear-cut, and by expanding these existing emergency planning zones and requiring emergency exercises that encompass concurrent or initiating natural disasters, they would provide vital training to emergency personnel and would extend an essential layer of protection to millions of Americans. My colleague, Dominique French of NEARS, is going to go into a little more detail about some of the thinking behind that petition in a few moments. I want to focus today on two issues that need to be part of this process you're working on now. The first is the inappropriate use of computer codes and simulations about accident consequences in emergency planning regulation. And the second is our changing understanding of the risks of radiation exposure and the public's changing expectations about the level of protection expected from emergency response to nuclear accidents and the changes that have occurred since the regs were promulgated more than 30 years ago. So let me talk about the computer simulations first. It's been brought up here a couple times today about the SOARCA. Computer simulations of accident causes and consequences, like SOARCA, do have an important function. They can identify and alert regulators and reactor operators to weaknesses or vulnerabilities in specific reactor designs and cause improvements in those designs. They can identify and alert regulators to the probable paths and source terms of some radiation releases in the event systems fail, and that can potentially lead to more effective emergency response. I mean, these types of things do have a purpose. But what computer simulations like SOARCA cannot do, especially in the context of emergency response planning, is substitute for real-life experience. And we have had, over the past 32 years or so, far too much real-life experience that has had a direct bearing on emergency planning. I mean, let's face it, on March 10th, 2011, the odds of a nuclear accident involving multiple explosions at reactor buildings, multiple simultaneous meltdowns, and multiple threats to fuel pools would have been considered so infinitesimally insignificant that such a scenario would never have shown up in a computer simulation such as SOARCA. And go back and look, SOARCA doesn't consider that. And yet this happened, real life. 25 years earlier, it's unlikely very many computer simulations predicted that operators would deliberately disable essential safety systems and then try to run tests on an essentially unstable reactor. That's what happened at Chernobyl. Now, today's computer simulations probably would and hopefully do consider the type of component failures we had at 3 Mile Island and possibly even a bunch of the operator errors that occurred there as well. But of course, their earlier counterparts didn't predict that before 1979. Such an accident, as you'll recall, was officially considered incredible. Real life has a way of changing assumptions that are programmed into computer simulations. So the point is that these simulations, such as SWARCA, can never encompass the full gamut of the limitless possibilities that real life can and does deliver, nor the scenarios of the future that may be currently beyond our imaginations. Maybe now computers and regulations can be reprogrammed to account for the effects of a massive earthquake and tsunami on an unprepared nuclear reactor complex. But that isn't likely to be the cause of the next nuclear disaster. More likely, it is something that currently is considered so infinitesimally small that it isn't even being considered at all. But that is precisely the kind of thing emergency evacuation and planning regulations, which are the last defense to protect the public after all else fails, that's what these regs must address, what they must be prepared for, what they must be effective against. Real life experience matters. Now, at Fukushima, real life actually gave the Japanese a break. Fully 80% of the airborne radiation released by the Fukushima accident went directly east over the Pacific Ocean, never threatened land. Of course, we're already hearing some nuclear apologists argue that the consequences of Fukushima aren't so great, or, no one's died that they know of, so they say, or radiation levels are lower than someone might have expected. But think about this real life for a moment. The wind had been blowing from the melting Fukushima reactor steadily toward Tokyo with the same intensity it was blowing to the Pacific Ocean, and 500% more radiation had been deposited over that densely populated area than actually was. No one would be trying to downplay the effects of Fukushima. It wouldn't be possible, and Japan would right now be struggling to survive as a nation. And it should go without saying, I hope, that relying on favorable wind patterns is not an acceptable emergency response technique. Let me talk for a moment about our changing understanding of the risks of radiation exposure and the public's changing expectations about the level of protection. The NRC's emergency planning regulations, as you know, including the 10-mile EPZ, were promulgated after the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, during which pregnant women and children, a few thousand people, Eric talked about that, within 5 miles of the reactor were advised by Pennsylvania's governor to evacuate. Of course, the actual evacuation involved hundreds of thousands of people from dozens of miles away. In adopting its regulations and later on in denying a petition to expand the EPZ following the Chernobyl disaster, the NRC decided that a 10-mile planning and evacuation zone is sufficient to protect the public from acute effects of radiation exposure. In other words, to prevent instant death from a large, fast-moving, but relatively short release of radiation, a spurt of radiation, if we will, a very intense spurt of radiation. But as real life has shown, nuclear accidents are not necessarily short, they're not necessarily fast-moving. Both Fukushima and Chernobyl spewed massive amounts of toxic radiation for days. In Fukushima's case, for months. And indeed, a year and a half later, Fukushima is still releasing radiation on a level that would be considered unacceptable here. And since 1979, two other things have happened. One is our understanding of the effects of radiation have improved, and in tandem with that, the public is no longer content, if indeed the public ever was content, with protection only against such acute exposures that might cause early death. Rather, government protection and regulation against environmental threats of all kinds, not just radiation, must be oriented toward protection against many other adverse consequences, such as cancers and other disease. And to the extent possible, economic losses, displacement, and the like. The American public has learned through the National Academy of Sciences Biological Effects of Radiation Committee report, the Beer 7 report a few years ago, that there's no such thing as a safe level of radiation exposure. Any exposure holds some risk. The risk rises with the level of exposure. Moreover, women are 50% more susceptible to radiation exposure than men, and children are even more susceptible than women. Yet, the NRC and EPA radiation exposure standards, which are what your protective action guidelines are based on, they're antiquated. They're based on exposure to the average man rather than to the most vulnerable among us. And there is, of course, no way to limit radiation exposure only to the most vulnerable of us in the accident situation. The American people expect to be protected against radiation levels that would cause acute symptoms, but they also expect to be protected against radiation levels which are actually more likely that would cause cancer or other diseases. Now I'm going to rush along here a little bit. The American people simply will not accept being abandoned essentially in areas where they could receive radiation exposures after a nuclear accident that could cause thyroid cancers. We've already started to see thyroid cancers, confirmed thyroid cancers from Fukushima, and other cancers and diseases, especially since with adequate evacuation measures, those diseases could be prevented. And I certainly would not want to be the government official who tried to tell the American people afterwards that it just isn't that important to evacuate because, after all, the government's determined, well, these levels aren't going to kill you immediately. It's going to take some time. That official is going to get, the coveted award. Heck of a job, Brownie. In real life, the largest releases do tend to come early, which calls for evacuation rather than a more deliberate relocation. And even if at Fukushima the levels were not immediate life-threatening, they were significant. They were certainly high enough in the first hours and actually the first several days to cause greatly increased risk of cancer and other disease to those exposed. And there would have been a lot more exposed if there hadn't been some evacuation going on, further than we evacuate, by the way, and if the wind had been blowing toward the populated areas rather than the Pacific Ocean. So without planning, without knowing the evacuation routes, without training, a Fukushima accident in a highly populated area, Indian Point, San Onofre, Limerick, any of the dozens of other sites, would lead to mass chaos and panic and to publicly unacceptable levels of consequences. The NRC's job is to prevent that. When reactor safety systems fail, and they obviously do in real life, emergency planning and response is the last line of defense. Right now, that line isn't good enough. It isn't strong enough to meet the needs of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mariotte.